have this scrap piece of ash that I'm going to be kerfing, and I've chosen this scrap piece partially because it's made out of ash, so I know that it has long flexible fibers, and then also because it has pretty straight grain on both the face and the edge, so I know that even though I will be creating lots of long grain, this is sort of like setting myself up for as little run out as is possible, even though I will still have plenty of run out. So the first thing I'm going to do is make all of my long grain rip cuts. So I've set the height of the table saw to just below the height of this ash. I'd say I probably have a skinny 1/16 below the surface of this ash. And I'm going to be making kerfs on the waist side of my board, so not the side that's up against the fence, because as soon as I have made kerfs in the wood, I'm going to be able to squish it closed. Those kerfs are going to give the width of the wood some flexibility, and I don't want to put myself in a position where I'm going to be squishing onto my blade and pinching my blade. So I'm going to keep all of my curved cuts on the waist side of the saw. And then I'll be adjusting my fence every single time. And because this board is only about 1 1/4 inches, it's not really worth it for me to set up a kerfing jig. So instead, I'm just going to be eyeballing this particular set of kerfs just to save myself time. But once I start cutting my kerfs cross grain, then I will be setting up a jig pretty similar to a finger joint jig. So that way I have a fixed distance between my kerfs. Now that I've cut the kerfs in the long grain of this piece of ash, I'm now ready to cut kerfs in the cross grain, or across the grain, I should say. And what I'm going to do for that is basically make a modified finger joint jig. So those of you that have taken intro when it was still 6 credits, you'll know that a finger joint jig looks very similar to this. It basically has 2 table saw kerfs cut out of a sacrificial fence. The kerfs act as a 0 clearance fence so that the fibers of the wood are completely supported. And then sticking out of one of those kerfs, this one might be a better example. Sticking out of one of the kerfs of the sacrificial fence is a key. And the key is the exact dimension of the kerf of the table saw. So once I cut my board with the table saw, I can then lock the kerf that I just cut onto the key against my fence. So it's going to be critical, the spacing between the key and the empty kerf on your sacrificial fence, because if it's off even a little bit, then it's going to exponentially become more and more inaccurate the longer your finger joints, or in this case your kerfs, span. So what I did to make my key, because it's had to be exactly 1/8 of an inch to match the thickness of my table saw blade, is I glued together 2 1/16 pieces of veneer, knowing that a piece of 1/8 inch wood by itself isn't really all that stiff and resistant to torque, but when 2 pieces of veneer are glued together and they have that glue seam, they become a lot more stiff. So when I lay the kerf of the table saw onto my key, it's a lot less likely to get pulled one direction or another. And then lastly, I needed to space my key. You can see I haven't cut the second kerf yet. but I needed to space my key away from the table saw blade exactly 3/8 of an inch. So my table saw blade is exactly 1/8 of an inch. My key is also exactly 1/8 of an inch. And as I create the curved cuts on the table saw, I'm skipping every other cut so that I can cut from the other face of the wood. So I don't know if that's super clear, but essentially, because I'm cutting from both faces, both directions on my wood, I'm kerfing it in both directions. I can't just have my kerfs spaced like they are on my sanding block, which is just every 1/8 of an inch. I need to have room for there to be a kerf from the other direction. And because I know my table saw blade is exactly 1/8 of an inch, then that means that the distance between two kerfs on the same face of the board will be 3/8 of an inch. So what I did was I ran the sacrificial fence, which is just a little scrap piece of plywood I have. I ran it through on my sled, just kind of randomly. All I needed was to just have the kerf of the blade. Then I glued my key in there for added stiffness, because I don't want the key flopping around or falling out during my cut. Then I positioned my fence right up against the table saw blade with the blade pointing towards my key. And I, in this case, measured, which I don't know if it's the most accurate way, but this setup, because the measurements I'm dealing with are so small, it was just a little bit too finicky otherwise. Because normally with the finger joint setup, because you're making a cut every other thickness of your dado stack, it's a lot easier to just make 2 keys. And then when you're originally setting up this first cut, you just slide the key next to your fixed key, and that automatically spaces your cut appropriately. But because I basically have the distance of 3 keys between my fixed key and the table saw blade, for me it was just a little bit more practical to have a ruler here and to measure to 3/8 of an inch. So hopefully it's right. If it's not right, once I make enough cuts, I'm going to gradually see the kerf become uncentered. And at that point, if it's uncentered, I can just bump the fence a tiny, tiny amount one direction or the other to correct for that. I should be ready to make my second cut now through my sacrificial fence. And then I should be able to start cutting my piece of ash. So at that point, you kind of get into a rhythm because you're doing a very repetitive motion. So just make sure every single time you do place the ash down on the key, you're placing it down so that it's fully seated. There aren't any dust or crumbs in the way that would make your key slot a little bit smaller. And then make sure that it is fully butted up against your sacrificial fence as well. Any kind of inaccuracies are going to continue to telegraph throughout all your remaining cuts. So you really want to make sure that you get into a rhythm of checking for accuracy every single time. So I've made the second kerf through my sacrificial fence. I'm now ready to start cutting into my ash board. And the first cut that I want, I'm not going to be able to use my key in the way that I intend to use it for the rest of the board. But I can use my key as a sort of physical stop. So I know that my first cut wants to be 1/8 of an inch in to my board. So what I can do is I can put something that's 1/4 of an inch, because this is a 3/8 distance from the key to the cut, to the table saw blade. So I'll put 1/4 of an inch piece of plywood there, and that will act as a stop So when I go to cut this, when I go to take this cut, it should cut exactly 1/8 of an inch off of the end. And that will give me a reference for this side of my board. Then I'll have to freehand again the other side of the board, and that will be exactly 3/8 of an inch in. So that way I can just have this pressed up right against my key right there. So the beginning is a little bit iffy because you have so many factors that you're counting on to have been set up correctly. But once you do dial in that setup, then you can just keep going forever. As you saw on my plastic piece, which is about 5 feet long.